Somewhere in Europe, roughly 40,000 years ago, a person died. We don't know their name, we don't know what they called themselves, what language moved through their throat, what songs they sang to their children on cold nights when the wind came down off the glaciers and the world felt impossibly large and impossibly dark. All we have is a fragment, a piece of bone, a tooth, maybe, a scatter of tools left on a cave floor, and recently something almost miraculous, a thread of DNA pulled from that ancient material, decoded in a laboratory, and read like a letter written across an unimaginable distance of time. This is where the story of Europe's first people lives. Not in grand ruins or written records, but in the ice, in the sediment, in the calcium of old bones that somehow survived when everything else about these people was lost. And the more carefully scientists look, the stranger and more beautiful the picture becomes. Because what the DNA is telling us doesn't match the stories we used to tell. Some of the lineages that show up in Ice Age Europe seem to appear, thrive for thousands of years, and then quietly vanish. Not replaced all at once, not wiped out in any single catastrophe you could point to, but fading, dissolving into the genetic record like a voice getting quieter in a long corridor until you can't hear it anymore. Who were these people? That's the question at the heart of everything we're going to explore tonight. Not just who lived in Europe during the Ice Age, but why certain populations seem to leave almost no trace in the people living there today. Why some of the oldest lineages seem to hit a kind of genetic dead end. Why Europe, a relatively small peninsula of a much larger landmass, became one of the most complicated and layered chapters in all of human prehistory. If you're listening to this as you drift off to sleep, that's exactly what it's here for. A lot of you are scattered across the planet right now at wildly different hours, and I genuinely love thinking about that. So, if you feel like it, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is where you're listening. Berlin at 2 in the morning, Sydney at breakfast. Somewhere in Canada with the snow coming down outside. It's one of the stranger, quieter joys of making these, knowing that the same story is reaching people in completely different skies. So tell me where you are now. Before we go anywhere else, it helps to understand just a little bit about how ancient DNA actually works, and more importantly, what it can and can't do, because it's easy to hear phrases like genome sequencing or haplogroup and assume scientists have everything figured out. They don't. Ancient DNA is fragile almost beyond description. The same processes that preserve a bone for 40,000 years, the cold, the chemistry of certain cave soils, the particular minerals in the sediment, also slowly destroy the genetic material inside it. Most of the time nothing survives at all, and when something does survive, it's in pieces. Tiny broken fragments of a genetic instruction manual that once told a complete human body how to build itself. What researchers do at its most basic level is reassemble those fragments. They compare them to DNA from other ancient individuals, from modern populations, from our closest evolutionary relatives, and they look for patterns. Which populations are closely related? Where did people come from, and when did they move? Which lineages contributed to later populations, and which ones simply stopped contributing? The results are never complete. Every ancient genome we have is a partial picture, and the ancient genomes we don't have, the people who died in conditions that didn't preserve their DNA, the ones whose remains we simply haven't found yet, those gaps are enormous. But in the last 15 years or so, the technology has improved at a speed that still surprises the scientists working in the field. What used to be impossible is now routine, and every new genome pulled from the ice rewrites some part of the story we thought we understood. What the ancient DNA revolution has done, more than anything else, is replace a relatively simple narrative with a complicated one. The old story went something like this. Modern humans arrived in Europe around 40 to 45,000 years ago, replaced or absorbed the Neanderthals who had been there for hundreds of thousands of years, and then more or less continuously populated the continent ever since. The people of the Ice Age became the people of the forests, became the people of the early settlements. A line, more or less straight, maybe a little branching, but fundamentally continuous. The new story is nothing like that. It involves multiple waves of people moving into and across Europe at different times, under different climate conditions. It involves populations that survived the harshest cold by retreating to small, warmer pockets at the edges of the continent, isolated from each other for thousands of years, genetically drifting in different directions. It involves those isolated groups coming back together when the ice retreated, mixing, and sometimes one group's genetic contribution simply swamping the others almost entirely. And it involves at least one episode that looks, from the DNA, like something quite dramatic happened in the West, something that changed the genetic makeup of European populations in ways that researchers are still arguing about. We're going to move through all of it slowly. From the earliest modern human footprints in Ice Age Europe to the mammoth hunters of the Gravettian world, through the long freeze that pushed people to the very edges of the continent, and into the gradual return of forests and new populations after the ice pulled back. We'll look at when the first farmers arrived from the east and what that meant for the people already there. And at the end, we'll sit with the question that gives this whole story its particular quiet sadness. Some of these people, these Ice Age Europeans with their specific genes and their specific ways of living, left almost no descendants we can identify. They were here. They were real. They made things and buried their dead and survived conditions that most of us can barely imagine. And then the record of them goes quiet. Not with a bang. Just with a silence that the DNA eventually stops filling in. That's what we're really looking at tonight. Not just who was here, but who disappeared, and why the ice sometimes keeps names we'll never get to know. So let's spend a little time with the tool itself, because everything that follows depends on understanding what ancient DNA actually is, what it captures, and where it goes quiet on you. Start with preservation. Genetic material begins breaking down the moment a living thing dies. Enzymes, bacteria, moisture, heat, they all work on DNA the way time works on paper, slowly reducing something legible into something fragmentary, and then into nothing at all. The conditions that occasionally stop this process are very specific. Cold helps enormously, which is one reason some of the best preserved ancient genomes come from permafrost or from cold cave sediments in northern Europe. Certain minerals in soil chemistry can slow the decay. Dense, compact bone, especially the petrous bone inside the skull, the hard knot just behind the ear, tends to hold genetic material better than most other tissue. But even with all the right conditions, what survives is almost never complete. What researchers extract is usually something closer to confetti from an original document than anything you'd call a full text. Then there's contamination. This is one of the problems that kept ancient DNA research unreliable for years, because modern human DNA is everywhere. It's on the hands of the archaeologist who lifted the bone out of the ground. It's in the air of the lab. It's on every surface. The DNA of a 40,000-year-old individual might make up only a tiny fraction of the genetic material in a sample, and distinguishing ancient fragments from modern contamination requires painstaking methodology and statistical caution. Results come with confidence intervals. They come with probabilities. When scientists say a particular individual was closely related to a population further east, they usually mean something more like the evidence is consistent with that interpretation at a certain level of statistical confidence. It's not a photograph. It's more like a very careful estimation of what a photograph might have shown. And this matters for how you listen to everything that comes next. Because ancient DNA results are genuinely revelatory, but they're also genuinely incomplete, and the picture shifts every time a new genome is added. Now, the genetic markers themselves. There are three main types used in ancient population studies, and each one captures something different. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited only from the mother. It doesn't recombine, doesn't shuffle the way most of your genome does, so it tracks a single continuous maternal line stretching back through time. It's relatively abundant in cells, which makes it more likely to survive in ancient remains, and it's been used longer than any other genetic tool in this field. The clusters of mitochondrial variation are called haplogroups, and you'll hear those names throughout this story. Things like haplogroup U or haplogroup H, each representing a branch of a family tree defined by shared maternal ancestry. E-chromosome DNA does the same thing, but for paternal lines, transmitted from father to son unchanged. It's much rarer in ancient samples because there's only one Y chromosome per cell, compared to hundreds of copies of mitochondrial DNA. But when it's recoverable, it adds a different layer to the picture. And then there's autosomal DNA, which is the vast bulk of the genome, the 22 pairs of chromosomes that carry most of what makes you genetically you. This is the richest source of information because it reflects the whole ancestry of an individual, rather than a single line. It's also the most complex to interpret because it's inherited from both parents and recombines with every generation, making the signal harder to trace the further back you go. Here's where the important distinctions come in, the ones worth holding gently as the story unfolds. Ancestry and identity are not the same thing. A person's DNA can point to population origins in one region, while everything about their material culture, their tools, their burial practices, the objects they made and used, connects them to a completely different tradition. Population and culture are not interchangeable either. Two groups can share a genetic signature and have radically different ways of living. Or two groups can share a near-identical material culture while being genetically quite distinct, connected by trade and imitation rather than descent. And lineage and language almost certainly diverged repeatedly across prehistoric Europe. The same people speaking different languages, different people speaking related ones. DNA tells us nothing directly about what words moved through anyone's mouth. The sampling problem compounds all of this. Europe's Ice Age populations were small and unevenly distributed, and the places where remains happen to survive are not necessarily the places where most people live. If you find 5 genomes from one cave and nothing for several hundred miles in any direction, you don't know whether those 5 individuals represent a widespread population, a tiny, isolated group, or something in between. The silence in the record could mean absence, or it could mean that the people who lived there died in conditions that didn't preserve anything, and we simply haven't found them yet. This is why researchers don't rely on DNA alone. A genome gets cross-checked against the artifacts found in the same layers of sediment, against radiocarbon dates that tell you when someone lived, against stable isotope analysis that can say something about what they ate and where they grew up, against pollen records and climate data that tell you what the world around them looked like. The picture that emerges is always a negotiation between different lines of evidence, each one incomplete on its own but more informative together. And the map is still being drawn. Every year new genomes come out of permafrost and cave floors and medieval churchyards and change something researchers thought they understood. Some of them confirm what the models predicted. Others introduce entirely new populations that nobody knew were there. The expectation going in should be that what we know now is not what we'll know in a decade. The story is not finished. It's barely begun. So with those limits in mind, we can finally walk out onto the continent itself, into a Europe that doesn't quite match the picture most people carry of the Ice Age. Not yet a world of endless snowfields and mammoths marching through blizzards, but something stranger and more changeable. A continent breathing in and out with the climate, forests advancing and retreating, grasslands widening, then shrinking again. Glaciers were there, yes, but they hadn't yet reached their greatest extent. Much of Europe, much of the time, was cold by our standards, but not frozen solid. Think long, hard winters and brief, sharp summers rather than an eternal deep freeze. Into this shifting world came people who were, genetically, already very close to us. Early modern humans, descendants of the African population you met in the bottleneck story, filtered into Europe in pulses, sometime after about 50,000 years ago. They weren't the first humans to see those valleys and rivers. Neanderthals had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. Their bones and tools are layered into the sediments of Spain, France, Germany, Italy, Ukraine, the Caucasus. For a long stretch, if you could have walked from Iberia to the Levant, almost every human you met would have been Neanderthal. What happens when modern humans first appear in that landscape is one of the great open questions. The archaeological record suggests there were episodes of overlap, regions and centuries where Neanderthals and early modern humans may have occupied neighbouring valleys or even used the same caves at different times. The genetic evidence says that somewhere in those zones of contact they interbred. Most people alive today outside Africa still carry small amounts of Neanderthal DNA as a trace of those encounters. But the transition wasn't instantaneous, and it wasn't simple replacement everywhere at once. Depending on which site you look at, you see different stories. In some regions, Neanderthal-associated tools vanish and are replaced by new technologies that look tied to modern humans. In others, there are sequences where things blur, where industries with mixed features appear for a while and then disappear again. Researchers argue about which layers represent Neanderthals experimenting with new ideas, which represent incoming modern humans, and which might involve both. Underneath that debate is a quieter reality. Europe before the deep cold was a patchwork. Different environments, different human groups, different ways of surviving. Imagine moving across that patchwork in the south, along the Mediterranean coasts. You'd find more wooded landscapes, open oak forests, scrubby hillsides dotted with juniper and pine, river valleys rich in plant foods and small game. Further north, as climates cooled and dried, the trees would thin out into vast steppe tundra, a mosaic of grasses, sedges and hardy shrubs stretching for hundreds of miles. These open spaces were the engine rooms of Ice Age ecology, supporting extraordinary densities of large herbivores. This is where the famous megafauna come in, but not as a static parade of exotic animals. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, steppe bison, wild horses, reindeer, giant deer with antlers like living trees. Their movements tracked the seasons, the snow line, the flush of new growth in spring. To live here successfully as any human meant syncing your own movements with those herds, following migration routes, knowing where rivers froze shallow enough to cross and where they stayed treacherous, anticipating where storms would funnel snow into drifts that trapped weak animals. Pre-glacial Europe, before the ice sheets reached their maximum, offered something precious: diversity of habitats. If one region suffered a bad winter, there were others that might still support life. Forest fringes where you could hunt red deer and wild boar, wetlands where waterfowl and fish provided fallback resources, limestone massifs riddled with caves that offered shelter from wind and cold. In this sense, the world was harsh but generous. It gave options, and options are what small, vulnerable populations need. The archaeological traditions we assign names to in this period, things like the initial Upper Paleolithic, the Chattel-Perronian, the Aurignacian, are really patterns in stone and bone. They're clusters of artifacts that share shapes, techniques, and raw materials. They're how we try to map human behaviour in a time when genes are still mostly silent. Some of those early Upper Paleolithic industries suggest astonishing mobility. The same style of blade or ornament turns up from the Levantine corridor to Central Europe, from the foothills of the Alps to the plains of eastern France. At some sites, the stone used to make tools can be traced back to quarries 100, 200 kilometres away. That implies either people moving long distances themselves or materials passing hand to hand through chains of exchange. Other evidence points the same way. Personal ornaments made from shells that come from distant coasts show up far inland. Teeth of Arctic fox and other animals not local to a site appear, drilled and worn as pendants. To many archaeologists, this suggests networks, groups who knew of one another, perhaps met periodically, perhaps exchanged mates and stories and ritual objects. Thin threads of connection stretched across a continent that could easily have fractured into isolated pockets. But how those threads map onto populations is where the certainty fades. You can have a single broad material culture, like the Aurignacian, spanning thousands of kilometres. Does that mean one genetically coherent population spread out over that range? Or multiple biologically distinct groups copying the same successful toolkit and style? Early genetic samples from this time are rare enough that we can't yet draw confident boundaries. Where we do have DNA from early modern humans in Europe, a tentative picture emerges. Some early individuals seem only distantly related to later Europeans, as if they belonged to lineages that later died out or were swamped by later arrivals. Others look more like the ancestors of populations that would survive the coming glacial maximum. The pattern that's slowly coming into focus is not continuous occupation everywhere, but waves. Pulses of people expanding into favourable conditions, then retreating, fragmenting, or disappearing when climates shifted. This is one of the points where archaeology and genetics lean against each other. In some regions, the tool traditions look continuous across climatic fluctuations. That continuity might give the impression of stable populations hanging on in place. The genomes we have, though, sometimes suggest replacement, a new group arriving with a broadly similar culture, blending in so neatly that only the DNA reveals the turnover. Researchers don't all agree on how frequent these replacements were, or how sharply you should draw the lines between one population and another. Some models emphasize long-term regional continuity, with local groups adapting but persisting. Others see Europe as repeatedly recolonized from refuges further south or east whenever conditions allowed, with earlier inhabitants contributing little to later gene pools. The truth may be different in different corners of the continent. What matters for the rest of the story is that by the time the ice sheets began their final push, Europe was already a land of experiments. Experiments in mobility, bands ranging over hundreds of kilometres, tethered to raw material sources and migration routes. Experiments in social scale, networks big enough that ideas about tools and ornaments could spread faster than any single family line. Experiments in coexistence, modern humans occupying a continent that had been Neanderthal for ages, sometimes replacing, sometimes blending, always adjusting. All of this sets the stage for the genetic turning points we can actually see clearly later on. The distinct Ice Age lineages that appear in the DNA, Western hunter-gatherers, Eastern groups, Southern refugial populations, don't emerge out of nowhere in the middle of the cold. They have their roots in these earlier movements and mixtures, in decisions made by people walking through forests that no longer exist, and across grasslands that are now the floors of seas. As the climate begins to tilt toward its coldest phase, those experiments will be tested. Some ways of living, some networks, some lineages will survive the deep freeze and re-expand when the ice retreats. Others will vanish without leaving a genetic trace we can recognize. In the next part of the story, we'll watch the first of those waves arrive, leave their fragile footprints, and then fade into the white noise of the glacial world. The first of those waves that we can see clearly in the DNA arrived just before 40,000 years ago, in a Europe that is cooling but not yet crushed by ice. If you follow the bones and the few genomes we have, one of the earliest recognizable modern human presences in Western Eurasia comes from a skeleton in what is now Romania, sometimes called Oase 1. Genetically, he is astonishing, a modern human with a Neanderthal ancestor only a few generations back. His genome carries long, unbroken stretches of Neanderthal DNA the telltale sign of very recent interbreeding. But here's the strange part. He doesn't look like the ancestor of later Europeans. When geneticists compare his DNA to people who lived after the last glacial maximum, or to living Europeans, the connection is faint. It's as if his lineage was a branch that grew, leafed out for a while, and then snapped off in a storm. He is probably not unique in that sense, as more early Upper Paleolithic genomes have come in from places like Bulgaria, Italy, the Czech lands, Siberia. The same broad pattern appears. You see small groups of modern humans arriving in Europe and Western Asia, sometimes mixing with Neanderthals, sometimes not, leaving hints of their existence in a handful of caves and rock shelters. And then, genetically, many of those lines fade, not because everyone died in a single disaster. More often it seems to be the quieter processes that erase them. These first modern human populations in Europe were likely tiny by modern standards. A cluster of bands, a few dozen or a few hundred people connected across wide areas, living in landscapes that could turn against them very quickly. In that situation, randomness alone can wipe out whole genetic lineages, a bad run of winters, a disease that hits one valley harder than the next, a volcanic eruption that dusts grazing lands in ash, shifting herds away from the roots people depended on. Even without a dramatic event, small groups are vulnerable to what geneticists call drift. In each generation, only some individuals have children. Some lines flourish by chance, others wither away. Over thousands of years, the chance outcomes pile up, and particular genetic signatures wink out, not because they were bad, but because they were unlucky. On top of that random fragility, there were the bigger climatic swings. Between 40 and 30,000 years ago, the climate yo-yoed in and out of colder and milder phases, sometimes very abruptly on human timescales. Forests retreated, then edged forward again. The open-steppe tundra shifted north and south. Rivers changed course or froze over for longer stretches of the year. Every shift like that would have squeezed some groups and opened opportunities for others. Bands hunting in upland regions might find their game vanishing downslope. Communities dependent on salmon runs could watch their spawning grounds change as meltwater patterns altered. A few misjudged migrations, a few years of failure, and an entire local population might fragment, its members scattering to other bands or dying out. From the outside, looking only at stone tools, you might not notice these collapses. The Aurignacian, that characteristic early Upper Paleolithic toolkit of long blades, bone points and personal ornaments, seems to spread widely and persist for thousands of years. If you track it on a map, it washes over much of Europe like a broad, stable zone of culture. But cultures are not genes, and that's where things become slippery. Imagine a successful hunting technique, or a new style of blade that makes butchering carcasses easier. You don't have to migrate with your whole family to spread that idea. You can pass it to a neighbouring band during a seasonal meetup, or they can see you using it and copy it. People marry into other groups, bringing their favourite ways of doing things. Traders carry finished tools or exotic ornaments to distant valleys, where local artisans imitate them. Over time, tool styles and ornaments can become shared across many populations who may not be closely related biologically. Archaeologists see this as cultural diffusion, ideas travelling faster and farther than people themselves. In that kind of world, a tool tradition like the Aurignacian can blanket half a continent, while underneath, the genetic landscape is patchy and constantly rearranging. This is one reason early lineages can vanish from our genetic record without leaving obvious archaeological breaks. A group may be replaced demographically, its members absorbed into neighbouring bands, its territory taken over by newcomers without a dramatic change in the material culture. The newcomers might adopt the same blade shapes, the same ornaments, the same ritual habits. To the stones and bones, the story looks continuous. To the DNA, it is a quiet turnover. Sometimes the opposite happens. A tool style can disappear from a region, replaced by a new industry with different shapes and techniques, while the underlying people are mostly the same. They may simply have shifted strategies in response to climate or resources. If we had only the artifacts, we might infer an invasion. If we had only the genomes, we might infer continuity. Often, the truth is a tangle of both. When geneticists and archaeologists try to reconstruct these early waves, they talk in terms of bottlenecks and founder effects. A small group splits off from a larger population and moves into a new region. By chance, it carries only a subset of the genetic diversity of its parent population. If that offshoot expands and thrives, its particular genetic profile can dominate a whole region, even though it began as just one little branch. Now imagine that process repeating, layered over with climatic stress. Some early modern human groups in Europe may have been exactly these pioneers, founders of regional populations who flourished for a time, then either merged back into other groups or vanished when conditions turned against them. Their descendants might have been absorbed into later waves pushing in from the southeast or from refuges in the south during brief warmings. Over many cycles, their distinct genetic signals blur into the background. So why do some early Upper Paleolithic lineages seem to vanish entirely from later Europeans? One possibility is simply that they were numerically overwhelmed. Later, larger populations moving in during slightly more favourable climatic windows might have carried more people, more children, more genes. When two groups mix, the genetic contribution of the more numerous one dominates over time, even if the smaller group's culture remains influential for a while. Another possibility is geographic. Some early lineages may have survived, but not in Europe. They might have been pushed south into the Near East, east towards Central Asia, or confined to pockets we haven't yet sampled. Ancient DNA is still a tiny sample of the people who once lived. Gaps in our record can easily create the illusion of extinction. A third scenario involves true regional collapse. There are hints in some parts of Europe of abandoned landscapes, periods where very few sites are occupied, or where entire regions go silent in the archaeological record for centuries. In those pauses, local populations may have dwindled to nothing, leaving territories to be recolonized later by strangers whose ancestors had been sheltering elsewhere. Perhaps the most likely story is a blend of all three: absorption, replacement, and collapse repeating across different valleys and centuries. When we look back, what we see as early Upper Paleolithic Europeans are not a single ancestral population marching toward the future, but a series of experiments. Some of those experiments fed into the lineages that would later ride out the deepest cold and repopulate the continent. Others left only a few stray genetic threads in modern genomes, or none that we can currently trace. What makes their footprints feel so fragile is not just that their genes are rare. It's that the world they inhabited was unstable enough that no particular group could count on permanence. Survival meant living in motion, adjusting to shifting herds and shifting climates, building alliances that might or might not hold when resources grew scarce. In the layers of that uncertainty, in the waves you can just barely see in the DNA, the stage is being set for one of the most distinctive Ice Age cultures we know, the Gravettian and the mammoth hunters who would leave their mark across a frozen continent. When the Gravettian appears in the record sometime after 35,000 years ago, and taking firmer shape by 32 or so, it looks at first like just another tool tradition. Long, thin blades, delicate backed points, slender bone and antler points that might have been parts of spears or darts. Little carved figurines, some of them the famous Venus shapes with exaggerated hips and bellies. But if you step back from the individual artifacts and look at where they show up, a different picture comes into focus. You can trace Gravettian-style tools from the plains of what is now Ukraine and Russia, across the central European Loess belt, into the Moravian valleys of the Czech lands, over to Austria and southern Germany, down into northern Italy, and westward into France, and even the Iberian Peninsula. Across thousands of kilometres, in caves and open-air sites, the same general toolkit appears, with regional flavours, but a shared logic. On the surface, it looks like a single cultural horizon washing across Ice Age Europe. Underneath, life would have felt much more local. Gravettian groups seem to have lived in a world of strong seasons. Glaciers were growing in the north and in the high mountains. Winters lengthened. The open, grassy steppe tundra favoured big herds of cold-adapted animals: mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, steppe bison, reindeer, wild horse. These were not scattered, solitary animals. They moved in large groups, following predictable but shifting routes between wintering and summering grounds. The people followed them. Imagine a yearly rhythm: winter camps in more sheltered valleys or at the edge of forests, where you could find wood, fresh water and some protection from the wind. Spring and summer movements out onto the open plains, tracking herds as they calved and fattened, timing your arrivals to match migrations. Autumn hunts focusing on animals as they gathered before moving off again. Some Gravettian sites show evidence of more substantial structures, suggesting that at least for part of the year, people stayed put. At places like Dolny Vesternice and Pavlov in Moravia, at Mesolithic on the Ukrainian plains, archaeologists have found rings of mammoth bones, arranged in ways that look very much like the foundations of houses. The spaces inside and around them are littered with hearths, tools, ornaments, and food remains. Whether these mammoth bone dwellings were roofed with hides or turf, whether they were used year after year or just for a few seasons, is still debated. But they hint at a pattern: larger, more permanent winter aggregation camps, linked by paths of seasonal movement stretching across the steppe. Hunting mammoth and other big game at this scale was not something a few people could do casually. Gravettian weaponry includes sturdy spear points and smaller-backed bladelets that may have been inserts in composite projectiles. Some researchers suggest thrown spears or possibly atlatl darts were used, allowing hunters to strike from a safer distance. Kill sites show multiple animals taken in single episodes, sometimes in positions that suggest they were driven into natural traps, boggy ground, ravines, or the edge of a river or cliff. To pull that off, you need planning. You need scouts who know where the herds are likely to pass. You need people to build up snow or earth features that can steer animals, or to repair existing traps year after year. You need coordination between dozens of hunters and beaters. And you need a social structure that can bring those dozens together at the right time. This is where the idea of an Ice Age network becomes more than a metaphor. Across Gravettian Europe, similar ornaments show up: pierced animal teeth, beads carved from ivory and shell, little plaques of stone or bone incised with geometric patterns. Sometimes the raw materials are local, sometimes they are not. You find shells far from the sea, flint from distant quarries, appearing in places where local stone would have been good enough. Those exotic materials don't walk themselves across the continent. They move with people. One way is direct travel, individuals or families making long seasonal circuits, revisiting favoured spots, meeting the same neighbouring groups at regular times. Another is through chains of exchange. A band in one valley trades mammoth ivory for high-quality flint from another band a few days' walk away. That second group passes a portion of it on to a third in exchange for pigments or ornaments. Over generations, materials and styles can travel hundreds of kilometres through many hands. When geneticists look at ancient genomes from this time, they start to see that same pattern in the DNA. Before, in the earlier Upper Paleolithic, individuals like Oase I and his contemporaries often appear as lonely twigs on the family tree, unique mixes of ancestry that do not clearly lead into later Europeans. With Gravettian-associated remains, a different structure emerges. People buried far apart in space and time, say in Italy and the Czech lands or in France and Austria, sometimes share a recognizably similar genetic background. It's not uniform, There are regional differences, and there are hints of admixture from earlier or neighbouring groups. But compared to the chaotic patchwork earlier on, Gravettian genomes suggest more stable, more persistent population clusters. One way to picture it is as a set of broad genetic bands stretching roughly east-west, overlapping and interweaving, but with enough continuity that you can still see them thousands of years later. Within each band, people are more closely related to each other than to those in distant regions. Between bands, there is some exchange, but not total mixing. How does that happen in a world of small hunting bands? Part of the answer lies in kinship and marriage rules. In foraging societies today, it's common for individuals to move between bands over their lifetimes, often at marriage. A woman might leave the group she grew up in and join her partner's community, or both partners might settle in a third band where they have relatives. Over time, these movements stitch local groups together into wider networks. If Gravettian people did something similar, their genetic landscape would reflect those patterns. Within a regional network, where bands meet regularly to hunt or exchange goods, marriage partners would usually be drawn from a known circle of allies that maintains genetic ties within the region. Between more distant regions, contact might be rarer. A few individuals might travel long distances as part of trade or movement, carrying their genes with them. But the majority of marriages would remain within a regional sphere. Over many generations, this would create the structured populations we start to see, connected enough that ideas and some genes spread, separated enough that distinct genetic signatures can persist. Group size matters too. If winter aggregation camps regularly brought together 50 or 100 people, the effective breeding population in a region could be bigger than you might expect from scattered small camps alone. A larger, more interconnected breeding pool slows down random drift and makes it more likely that certain genetic lineages will persist for millennia instead of being erased by chance. At the same time, these populations were not frozen in place. Climatic pulses, local overhunting or disease could still squeeze them, forcing bands to split, merge or move. When that happened, pieces of one regional genetic cluster could be carried into another, blurring boundaries in ways that are still being disentangled. This is where the relationship between culture and biology becomes slippery again. On the map of artifacts, the Gravettian looks relatively unified. Similar tools, similar ornaments, shared motifs like the Venus figurines, which appear from Central Europe to Western Russia and beyond. It's tempting to imagine a single people of the Gravettian, a continuous population stretching from the Atlantic to the Dnieper. The genomes suggest something more complicated. There are Gravettian-style sites whose inhabitants seem genetically distinct from each other. There are individuals whose cultural toolkit fits the Gravettian pattern, but whose ancestry carries traces of earlier or different groups. It's possible that some communities adopted Gravettian technologies and artistic styles without being closely related by blood to other Gravettian groups. In other words, cultural unity does not necessarily mean biological unity. A successful hunting strategy or a prestigious ornament style can spread across population boundaries. A small group with a particularly efficient mammoth hunting technique might share it at large seasonal gatherings. Other bands could adopt the method while remaining genetically closer to their old neighbours than to the original innovators. Over time, the shared practice becomes a hallmark of the Gravettian, even as the people using it come from multiple ancestries. Conversely, closely related populations might drift apart culturally as they adapt to different local conditions. Those living near rich mammoth corridors on the open steppe might organise their lives around big game hunting and winter aggregation camps. Those in more forested or mountainous edge zones might rely more on mixed hunting and gathering with different tool emphases, even if their DNA remains very similar. So when we speak of the Gravettian world of mammoth hunters, we're talking about a tapestry, threads of shared technology and art running across a continent, clusters of related genomes persisting through climatic ups and downs. marriage alliances and seasonal meetups binding neighbouring bands into regional networks, long-distance exchanges carrying shells, flint, ivory, and occasionally people between far-flung communities. Within that tapestry were individuals whose names we will never know, whose faces we can only guess at, but whose choices left patterns we can still trace in bone and DNA. They built houses from mammoth bones, watched the breath of animals steam in the frozen air, told stories around hearths while winter winds howled outside, and waiting beyond their horizon, slowly building in the north, was the ice itself, thickening and creeping forward, ready to test whether even this intricate network of mammoth hunters could endure. At first, the change is almost invisible. Winters that used to bite hard now seem to sink their teeth in a little deeper. Snow stays longer in the shaded gullies. Springs come late or come weak with more frost than thaw. A river that used to flood richly every year now fails to break its ice some seasons, or trickles instead of surging. To someone living through it, there is no sudden announcement that the last glacial maximum has begun. There is just an accumulation of bad years. The world of the Gravettian mammoth hunters had always been cold, but somewhere after about 27,000 years ago the trend shifts from harsh but manageable to something closer to relentless. Temperatures drop. Not just in winter, but on average, dragging down the whole yearly cycle. More of Europe dries out as vast amounts of water are locked into expanding ice sheets. The great glaciers in Scandinavia and the Alps swell and thicken. Sea levels fall, exposing new land in some places, but much of that new land is windswept, barren, and brutally exposed. The steppe tundra that had once been a relatively generous hunting ground becomes more extreme. In some regions, grass is thin. Shrubs and low plants struggle. The productivity of the land drops. Animals that once roamed in large, dependable herds may start to shift their ranges, bunching into smaller, more scattered pockets where food still grows thick enough to support them. For hunters tuned to subtle patterns of migration, this would feel like the rules changing mid-game. The old routes become less reliable. A valley that had always been good for reindeer in spring suddenly goes quiet. A ridge path that led predictably to mammoth wintering grounds now ends in lifeless snow and wind. Rivers freeze earlier and thaw later, complicating travel and cutting off familiar paths. As the cold deepens and aridity spreads, the habitable zones, the places where a small group of humans can find enough water, fuel, shelter and prey to make it through the year, start to shrink and fragment. On a map, climatologists can model this as zones of climatic suitability contracting southward and into sheltered pockets. To the people themselves, it would have felt like the world getting narrower. The loose continent-spanning web of Gravettian networks begins to fray. Some bands likely try to hold on in marginal areas as long as they can, eking out a living on smaller game, fish where possible, and whatever plant foods survive. Others make harder choices, abandon long-used territories, seek out rumours of better lands, or follow the last strong migrations of big game toward more stable refuges. Those refuges, refugia, in the language of paleoclimatology, become crucial. When researchers reconstruct Ice Age climates, certain regions keep appearing as relatively milder, more buffered zones even at the height of the cold. The Iberian Peninsula with its varied topography and Atlantic influence. The Italian Peninsula, shielded by mountains but washed by the Mediterranean. The Balkans, a complex patchwork of coastlines, valleys and uplands. Parts of what is now southern Ukraine and the lower Danube basin. Perhaps some pockets along the Black Sea and the northern shores of the Mediterranean more broadly. These were not tropical paradises. They were still cold, still seasonal, still demanding. But compared to the wind-scoured plains further north and east, they offered something precious, relative stability. In these refuges, rivers might stay unfrozen longer. Woodlands might cling to south-facing slopes. plant communities could support a richer food web. Herd animals might find enough browsing and grazing to remain in the area year-round, or at least return predictably. For human groups, this meant a choice between two broad strategies. One was to ride the edge, staying as far north as possible, exploiting whatever resources remained in the marginal lands, perhaps hoping for a break in the climate. The other was to retreat, to withdraw into these more favourable pockets and concentrate there, even if that meant crowding next to other groups. The genetic record suggests that, on the whole, retreat won. Over time, populations in much of Central and Northern Europe thin out, leaving fewer archaeological traces. In the south and southeast, by contrast, we begin to see evidence of denser, more continuous occupation, even as tool traditions shift away from the classic Gravettian. When you funnel people into shrinking habitable zones, something predictable happens to their DNA. Small groups that peel off into a refuge carry with them only a sample of the genetic diversity that existed in the wider population. This is the founder effect, the random subset of lineages that happen to be present in the few dozen or few hundred individuals who make the journey. Once isolated by distance, by impassable ice, by barren corridors with too little food, these groups undergo genetic drift. In each generation, by pure chance, some lineages become more common and others vanish. Over hundreds or thousands of years, even without strong selection, this random winnowing can give a refuge population a distinctive genetic profile. In a deep time sense, it's like taking a rich mixed paint and pouring small amounts into separate jars. Each jar starts as a sample of the original colour, but as you add tiny drops of new pigment, mutations, local adaptations, and stir them over time, each jar's colour drifts in its own direction. Ancient genomes from later periods hint at exactly this pattern. Individuals linked to southern refuges, like those in Iberia, often share certain genetic signatures with each other that are less common elsewhere. Those from Italy or the Balkans show their own recurring motifs. The earlier Gravettian-like background is still there, but it has been filtered through the bottleneck of refuge populations, leaving regional flavours that can persist long after the ice begins to loosen its grip again. How sealed off were these refuges? That is still very much an open question. One view imagines them as relatively isolated islands in a frozen sea. The distances between them, combined with harsh intervening climates, might have limited movement to rare episodes, an unusually mild phase, a desperate migration, a chance encounter at the edge of a glacier. Under this model, each refuge becomes a small evolutionary laboratory, drifting away from the others in both culture and genes. Another perspective envisions more permeability. Even during the coldest times, there may have been narrow corridors of somewhat milder terrain, along coasts, river valleys, or rain-shadowed slopes. Seasonal or generational movements along these paths could have linked refuges in a loose chain. Traders, marriage partners, or entire families might have moved between zones over the course of decades, slowly blending their gene pools and carrying ideas. The archaeological record offers mixed clues. Some tool traditions and ornament styles seem regionally distinctive, as if local groups were developing their own solutions and symbols. Others show hints of shared elements stretching across supposed refuge boundaries, implying at least occasional contact. The genetic data echo this ambiguity. Enough differentiation to suggest long-term separation, but also enough shared ancestry to hint that the doors were never fully closed. From a sleep-drenched vantage point, you can imagine it both ways at once. Long winters in a sheltered Iberian valley, where families tell stories about ancestors from the distant plains, stories that have drifted into myth. Somewhere over the mountains and along the coast, another group in an Italian hollow does the same, with stories carrying faint echoes of a common past. Once in a while, a stranger arrives speaking a familiar but strange dialect, wearing a slightly different style of bead or carrying a flint from far away. They stay or they move on, leaving a trace in the gene pool and in memory. Eventually, some of these pockets will flourish when the climate eases, sending their descendants back north and east to recolonize empty lands. Their genetic markers will spread like ink through water, colouring the populations of post-glacial Europe. Others may never get that chance. Some refugial groups could have been too small, too unlucky, or too vulnerable to local disasters, landslides, epidemics, a few bad winters in a row. Their distinct genetic lineages might have ended quietly, leaving behind only mute layers of ash and bone, or nothing at all that we can yet detect. When we look at the patchwork of ancient DNA in Europe, we see both patterns: lineages that seem to contract into tight knots during the coldest period, and then swell outward afterward, and lineages that show up briefly and then disappear. Behind those lines on a population graph were real communities huddled around fires, watching the stars through icy air, weighing impossible choices about where to go and who to follow. As the ice closes in, the great Gravettian tapestry is being torn into smaller pieces, each carried into its own corner of a darkening continent. Some pieces will be woven back into the fabric when the thaw comes. Others will remain as loose threads, frayed and lost, their stories locked in genomes we have not yet found, or that melted away with the last of their people, somewhere under the shadow of the ice. Life inside those refuges was not easy. It was simply possible. Imagine the Iberian coast during a glacial maximum winter. The sea is lower, the shoreline pushed far out from the cliffs we know today. The air is razor cold, but the ocean is a stubborn reservoir of heat compared to the land. Winds coming off the water are still brutal, yet slightly softer than the ones screaming over the continental interior. For people clinging to this edge, food is no longer just mammoth and reindeer. It's whatever the border between land and sea is willing to offer. Shellfish pried from rocks at low tide, fish trapped in shallow pools when the water retreats, seabirds taken from nesting ledges, their eggs gathered in season, kelp and seaweed, rich in minerals, dried and stored. Stranded whales or seals would have been absolute bonanzas, rare but unforgettable, providing meat, fat and bone far beyond what a single hunt could offer. Further inland, where rivers push their way through cold valleys, the menu shifts again. Salmon runs or other migratory fish, if present, become lifelines. Beavers, otters, waterfowl along the margins. In sheltered floodplains, even in harsh climates, a few hardy plants, roots, tubers, seeds might still be coaxed from the soil or gathered in the wild. Birch, willow and dwarf shrubs cling to the riverbanks, offering precious fuel and materials in a world where tall trees may be rare. Fuel is as critical as food. In exposed plains, firewood can become a limiting resource. In refuges, especially those with patchy woodland or thick shrub cover, the balance tips slightly in favour of survival. People learn every trick: burning dried dung from herd animals, gathering dead branches from windbreaks, stripping bark and twigs, using bones and fat as slow, smoky fuel when wood is scarce. Clothing, too, becomes a matter of life or death. Refuge populations likely perfected the art of layered insulation, soft inner garments of finely scraped hides, stitched with sinew using bone needles, outer layers of heavier furs with the hair left on, arranged so that the warmest, most water-resistant pelts shield the chest, back, and limbs. Hoods, mittens, and footwear probably received special care, wrapped in multiple layers, lined with fur, perhaps stuffed with dried grasses or moss for extra warmth, and to wick away moisture. To keep a child warm in a glacial refuge might mean reusing every scrap of hide, every leftover strip of fur. The genetic survival of a lineage sometimes rests on whether a mother's hands remembered the right stitch to keep a seam from leaking cold air. Shelter in these marginal landscapes takes advantage of whatever the land offers. Caves and rock shelters are obvious choices where they exist. They provide ready-made roofs, protection from wind, and stable internal temperatures. But not every refuge had caves, and not every group could depend on them year-round. Elsewhere, people likely built semi-subterranean houses, pits dug into the ground, roofed with poles, turf and hides. The earth itself provides insulation, smoothing out temperature swings. In open country, snow can be an ally, packed into walls or mounded as windbreaks. It can blunt the worst of the gusts. Along coasts and river mouths, driftwood becomes structural gold. Logs and large branches, carried from far-off forests and stranded by currents or floods, can be lashed together into frames that no living trees are available to provide. Bones of large animals, especially mammoths where they still exist, might also serve as supports, lintels and stakes. In this way, the edge of the world is not a single kind of place. It is a mosaic of narrow survivable zones, rock ledges above a stormy sea, willow-fringed river bends, south-facing slopes with a few stubborn trees, karst valleys catching slightly warmer air. From a climate map, these refuges appear as coloured blobs of suitability. From the inside, they are a constant negotiation between hunger, cold and ingenuity. Coastlines and river corridors are especially important in this picture because they do more than just provide food and shelter. They connect. A frozen plain may be nearly impassable for months. A river, once its ice thickens, can become a highway, a relatively flat, clear route threading through rough terrain. In slightly milder seasons, that same river offers water, fish and plant life along its banks. It ties scattered winter camps together into a knowable landscape. Coasts function similarly. Even when inland conditions are brutal, the narrow band where land meets sea can hold pockets of relative abundance. Birds, fish, marine mammals and stranded debris all concentrate there. People who move along this edge can travel long distances without ever straying far from critical resources. Genetically, the people who manage to persist in these refuges are not a random sample of everyone who once lived in Europe. They are the descendants of those who happen to be in reachable refugial zones or who successfully migrated there and who then weathered centuries of hard winters. We would expect their DNA to show the marks of repeated filtering. First, a contraction. Lineages that were common in Central and Northern Europe before the cold hit are winnowed, leaving only those tied to the southern and coastal refuges. Then, within each refuge, further narrowing as small groups split, move, or simply get unlucky. When the climate warms even modestly, these refuge-born populations begin to expand again. Their descendants push northward and inland, following rivers upstream, reclaiming valleys, stepping out onto plains that had been empty for thousands of years. In the ancient genomes, this looks like unfolding knots. Genetic clusters that seem tightly coiled in Iberia, Italy, or the Balkans during the coldest phase begin to spread their influence outward in later periods. People in Central Europe after the ice often carry signatures that point back to one or more of these southern pockets, like distant echoes of those cramped winter camps by the sea or in the river bends. This brings us to a debate that runs quietly under much of Ice Age research. Did most of post-glacial Europe's hunter-gatherers descend from one dominant refuge, a single main reservoir, perhaps in the southwest, whose population later fanned out and replaced or absorbed others? Or did multiple refuges, semi-isolated for millennia, all contribute substantially to the recolonization, seeding different regions with different blends of ancestry? In the one major refuge model, we would expect to see a strong, relatively uniform genetic signature spreading across much of Europe once the ice retreats, with only minor local variations. Other refuge lineages might appear only as faint traces, or not at all, suggesting that those groups dwindled or were absorbed early. In the multiple source model, the post-glacial patchwork should look more complicated. Different areas would carry different emphases, more Western refuge ancestry here, more Eastern or Southeastern refuge ancestry there. Borders between these genetic zones might blur over time as people intermarry, but the underlying structure would still be detectable. So far, limited ancient DNA hints at a complex reality, a mixture of shared ancestry and regional flavour, but our picture is deeply biased by what we can actually find. The lowest hanging evidence is often inland. Caves, rock shelters, river terraces now comfortably above sea level. Yet during the coldest times, some of the richest refuges may have been situated along coastlines that no longer exist in their Ice Age form. With sea levels more than 100 metres lower at certain points, vast coastal plains were exposed. People could have lived on landscapes that are now drowned, their camps, middens and burial sites buried under the continental shelf. When the ice melted and the oceans rose, whole chapters of human habitation were swallowed. This means that when we try to reconstruct refuge populations and their contributions, we are peering at an incomplete archive. Our current samples overrepresent those who lived inland or in higher, more durable locations. Entire coastal refugia, connected by rich marine resources and easy travel, might be absent from our record, their distinctive lineages merged only as ghostly components in later genomes. Somewhere out there, beneath the waves off Portugal, Italy, Croatia, or the Black Sea, there may be the lost camps of families who walked the glacial shorelines, their fires reflecting in icy surf. Their genes may survive in living people, but the details of their daily lives, their tools, their ornaments, their stories, lie under meters of water and sediment. When we talk about refuges at the edge of the world, then we are also talking about the edges of our own knowledge. We piece together meals from scattered bones and shells. We imagine clothes from needles and awls. We infer crowded winters from patterns in DNA. We argue over whether one refuge or many seeded the future. What is clear is that, in those darkest centuries, people found ways to endure in the thin borderlands where water still flowed, where wood still grew, where the sea still fed, and where the land offered just enough shelter against the enormous cold. From those narrow strongholds, the next chapter of Europe's human story would begin as the ice slowly, hesitantly, began to loosen its grip. The loosening is slow at first, not a dramatic melt, not a sudden green world, but a long, uneven exhale. Winters are still bitter, but the coldest extremes ease in fits and starts. Summers stretch a little longer, sunlight biting a little deeper into snowpack that once lingered all year. Glaciers stop advancing and begin to pause, then retreat, carving back from valleys they had filled like solid rivers. Plants are the first obvious sign if you're watching closely. Mosses and hardy grasses creep into patches of bare soil that stayed too cold before. Dwarf shrubs thicken. In some sheltered valleys, birch and pine begin to stake out a cautious foothold, forming scattered groves where before there was only tundra and wind. Where plants go, animals follow. Reindeer herds adjust their migration routes, finding new summer pastures on freshly exposed ground. Wild horses, bison, perhaps saiga antelope, spread into corridors that had been nothing but ice and rock for generations. Rivers swell with glacial melt, their banks rich with sediment, their floodplains offering wet meadows and thickets that attract everything that walks, swims, or flies. For human groups emerging from their refuges, the entire geometry of life starts to change. Hunting strategies shift. Instead of clinging stubbornly to a few reliable coastal or riverine niches, people can once again think in terms of seasonal rounds that cover larger territories. Following herds becomes more feasible. Returning to favoured hunting grounds year after year becomes possible, even predictable. Travel itself transforms. Surfaces that were once sheets of ice or treacherous snowfields become open ground. In some regions, frozen rivers remain winter highways. But now, in warmer months, boats or simple rafts might move people and goods along ice-free water. Paths that were blocked by glaciers for centuries reopen like doors in the landscape. settlement patterns begin to stretch and breathe. Instead of spending nearly all winter in a handful of deeply sheltered sites, groups can start to occupy a wider variety of camps. Spring hunting stations on river terraces, summer sites near reindeer crossings, autumn gathering places in wooded valleys where nuts, berries and game are concentrated. The year becomes a choreography of movement rather than a huddled defence. Archaeologists give a name to one of the most distinctive cultural expressions of this rebound: Magdalenian. It is not the name these people would have used for themselves. It comes from a site in France, La Madeleine, where tools and art from this period were first studied. But the term has stuck, and now Magdalenian stands as a shorthand for a broad cultural horizon that appears across much of Western and Central Europe after the height of the last glacial maximum. When we say Magdalenian, we are really talking about a pattern of tools, long, slender blades struck from carefully prepared cores, specialized bone and antler implements, elegant barbed points, likely used for spears and perhaps harpoons. The stone toolkits are often standardized in ways that suggest strong traditions and skilled instruction passed from elders to apprentices. A pattern of art engraved bones and antlers, carved figurines, and most famously, some of the richest cave paintings in Europe. Horses, bison, deer, ibex, abstract signs and hand stencils layered on walls deep under the earth. Whether every one of these sites truly belongs to the Magdalenian horizon in a strict chronological sense is debated, but this is the era when such imagery flourishes spectacularly, and a pattern of distribution. Magdalenian-style artifacts appear over a wide area, from the Iberian Peninsula through France and into parts of Germany, Belgium, and beyond. This spread, combined with the timing shortly after the ice begins to retreat, has long encouraged the idea that Magdalenian people were the great recolonizers of Western and Central Europe. For a while, this picture was built mostly from tools, bones, and cave walls. Now, ancient DNA lets us check how much of that cultural wave corresponds to a movement of actual people. When researchers manage to extract genetic material from skeletons associated with Magdalenian layers, a pattern begins to emerge. Many individuals share ancestry that seems to trace back to the western and southwestern refuges of the coldest period. Their genomes suggest a population that once clustered in those survivable zones and then expanded north and east as glaciers pulled back. In other words, at least some of what archaeologists call Magdalenian expansion is not just ideas travelling, it is families moving. Lineages that endured the worst winters in Iberia or southwestern France now send their descendants along newly opened river valleys into plains and basins that had been empty or nearly so for millennia. In Central Europe, in lands scoured by ice, the first post-glacial human DNA we find often carries these Western signatures. The story, though, is not purely one of replacement. In some regions, Magdalenian genetic profiles show hints of blending. Ghostly traces of earlier or neighbouring groups appear in the DNA, even when the tools in the ground look firmly Magdalenian in style. This suggests that as these expanding populations moved into new territories, they may have met, mingled with, or absorbed local hunter-gatherer groups whose material culture left fewer recognizable traces. Art and tools can spread faster than genes. A child born from parents of mixed origin might grow up carving bone points and shaping stone exactly like the rest of the band. A young hunter adopted into a Magdalenian group from a different background could learn to paint in the prevailing style while carrying a different genetic inheritance. From the archaeological record alone, these individuals are invisible. Ancient DNA is what reveals the hidden diversity beneath a common toolkit. Sometimes the opposite may also be true: genetic continuity with changing culture. In a few sequences, lines of ancestry seem to persist in a region, even as the style of tools and ornaments shifts from one named culture to another. This reminds us that labels like Magdalenian are our way of organising patterns, not necessarily sharp breaks experienced by the people themselves. A grandmother and a grandchild might share nearly the same DNA, yet archaeologists would place their belongings into different cultural boxes. This is where the idea of lost children begins to take shape. Within the Magdalenian horizon there are likely many distinct lineages, small family branches, local groups, even whole regional populations, that flourished for a few centuries and then disappeared as identifiable genetic signals. Some may have been swamped by later waves of ancestry spreading from other refuges or later expansions. Others may simply have drifted out of detection in our limited sample of ancient remains. In the genomes we do have, we see hints of this rise and fade. Certain genetic clusters appear in early Magdalenian contexts and then weaken or vanish in younger layers, replaced by slightly different combinations. Perhaps a once prominent group lost a key territory, or fragmented under environmental stress, or was gradually absorbed into neighbours. Their ideas might live on, techniques for carving antler, motifs in cave art, even as their particular genetic fingerprint dwindles. These are Europe's lost children of the post-glacial age. Not vanishing overnight like a dramatic extinction, but slowly thinning into the background, their unique combinations of genes and stories diluted into the broader human tapestry. They colonize the empty lands as the ice retreats. They leave handprints on cave walls. They send their hunters after reindeer along newborn rivers. And then, over thousands of years, their distinctiveness blurs. Later peoples will walk the same valleys, use some of the same shelters, follow some of the same routes. But in the DNA, in the deep, quiet record inside bones, we can sometimes see that those early Magdalenian expansions carried branches of humanity that did not continue in a straight, unbroken line into the present. Their memory survives in fragments, in a pattern of ancestry here, in a tool tradition there, in a painted bison still watching from stone. As the climate continues to warm and the forests start to advance, the stage set by the Magdalenian expansion will shift again. New ecological pressures, new opportunities, and new movements of people will begin to reshape the continent, especially in the far west, where something unexpected seems to happen. For a while, it looks as if the story will be simple. Western refuges send people north and east. Magdalenian toolkits spread. Reindeer routes are mapped out, rivers are learned, valleys are named and renamed in many languages we will never hear. The genetic signal from those southwestern survivors seems to flow across much of Europe, especially in the centre of the continent. If you stop the film there, it feels almost neat. A continent emptied by ice, then gradually refilled by one great wave of related hunter-gatherers. But when you let the tape run a little longer, an odd thing happens in the west. In some parts of Iberia and western France, the ancient DNA record suggests that the Magdalenian-linked ancestry that once dominated begins to fade. Not abruptly everywhere at once, but unevenly, like paint weathering from a wall. In its place, especially as we move into the final stages of the Ice Age and the earliest warm phases after it, we start to see a different genetic pattern associated with later cultural labels, like Azilian or Gravettian influences edging in from other directions. In Central Europe, too, the earliest post-glacial bones we have studied often look Magdalenian in ancestry. But by a few thousand years later, some regions are carrying a different mix, with stronger ties to groups that seem to have come from the south or east, rather than the old southwestern refuges. It is as if, after the first grand recolonization, the deck is shuffled again. Why this happens is still a matter of debate. Several possibilities line up, none fully proven, all plausible in a world that refuses to stand still. One driver may simply be movement along new paths. As the great ice sheets retreat further, they do not just expose more land, they redraw the map of what is easy or hard to cross. River systems settle into more stable courses. Wetlands expand in some basins, shrink in others. Coastal lines move scores of kilometres as sea levels rise. Passes that were blocked by ice open for the first time in tens of thousands of years. Human groups watching the sky and the ground would have seen opportunities. Bands based in Italy and the northern Balkans could follow valleys and passes northward and westward that had been closed or too marginal during the coldest phases. People sheltering around the Eastern Alps or along the Middle Danube could push into Central Europe along green corridors that were essentially new. If these migrants were numerous enough or persistent enough, their descendants could gradually come to dominate the ancestry in some regions, even if Magdalenian-linked groups had arrived earlier. The first to enter a landscape are not always the last to leave their genetic mark. Changing resources may also have tilted the balance. The Magdalenian world is built on a relatively open cold steppe ecology. Herds of reindeer, wild horses, bison, sometimes mammoth, moving across broad, treeless or sparsely wooded plains. Many of their finest tools and hunting strategies are tuned to that kind of world. But as the climate lurches toward warmth and then hesitates, and then lurches again, things become more complicated. Short, sharp warming events can allow shrubs and trees to surge forward, breaking up the open country. Sudden returns to chill, the kind of rapid reversals that punctuate the late glacial period, can drive some of those advances back. On a timescale of only a few centuries, the same valley might swing between open tundra, patchy woodland, and dense thicket. For a culture specialized in following large herds across open ground, dense forest is not just an inconvenience, it is a different world. Smaller game, different plants, more complex visibility. A hunting toolkit designed for long-range spear throws across flat snowfields may not be ideal for stalking deer through close-grown hazel and birch. Groups coming from other refuges, perhaps already adapted to more broken wooded terrain, might find themselves at an advantage as forests advance. Their ways of moving, hunting and gathering might simply fit the changing mosaic better. Over generations, those advantages could translate into more surviving children, more occupied territories, and eventually a stronger genetic presence. Disease could play a quieter but equally important role. As populations grow and become more connected, pathogens can travel farther, reach more hosts, and sometimes settle into new, stable relationships with human communities. People who have lived for many generations in relatively dense clusters may carry inherited resistances that others lack. A wave of illness moving along trade routes or shared hunting grounds might strike some groups harder than others, not through any drama we can see in the ground, but through small differences in immune systems shaped by long histories of previous exposures. In the genetic record, such invisible epidemics might appear as sudden shifts in ancestry, where one lineage thins while another persists. Lastly, there are social advantages, hard to see but powerful. Perhaps some incoming groups had slightly more flexible alliance systems, or more effective ways of sharing food in lean times, or more resilient ritual structures that help them coordinate larger networks. Perhaps their languages or their ways of negotiating marriages and exchanges made it easier to knit together scattered families into broader coalitions. In a world of rapid environmental change, those social traits can be as critical as any physical adaptation. A group that can quickly draw in outsiders, adopt orphans, and integrate small bands into a larger community may be more likely to absorb neighbours rather than be absorbed by them. When we look at the DNA, these complex processes can be reduced to a few simple patterns. In some western and central regions, Magdalenian-linked ancestry seems to be largely replaced by later components. In others, it lingers as one ingredient in a blended mix. In a few places, especially where our sampling is thin, it may still be present but invisible to us, hiding in gaps between the bones we have found and the bones we never will. Replacement is one interpretation, new people arrive in sufficient numbers, and gradually older lineages dwindle. Admixture is another. Instead of being swept away, existing groups intermarry with newcomers, creating a new hybrid population whose genetic profile looks different from either ancestor. A third possibility is more humbling: sampling gaps. The bones we have are a tiny, biased fraction of everyone who lived. Certain regions, like parts of Iberia or the Atlantic facade, are underrepresented in ancient DNA studies simply because preservation is poor, or excavations have been limited, or remains have not yielded usable genetic material. What looks like a disappearance might, in some cases, be an artifact of where we have looked. So archaeogeneticists proceed carefully. They point out that in the Franco-Cantabrian region, the transition from Magdalenian to later cultures like the Azilian coincides with noticeable shifts in ancestry, but not necessarily a clean break. They note that in the middle Danube basin and the plains to its north, early post-glacial genomes with strong western ties are followed by samples that draw more heavily on southern or eastern sources. They suggest that in some corners of Western Europe, particularly along the coasts, local Magdalenian-descended groups may have persisted longer than we can currently see, clinging to their own ways while the interior of the continent was already mixing in new arrivals. What seems clear is that the post-glacial story of Europe is not a single smooth gradient. It is pulses and eddies, periods when climate opens roots and draws people in, followed by reversals that push them out or fragment them. Regions where one ancestry blooms and others where it withers, even as tool traditions and art styles spread across genetic boundaries. In the far west, this means that some of the lost children we met in the Magdalenian horizon may have had even shorter futures than we imagined. Their descendants may have merged into new populations whose origins lay farther south or east, their once distinct signatures dissolved into broader patterns. Yet even as their genetic outlines blur, the landscapes they occupied, the rivers they followed, and the shelters they used will remain important. When the forests truly close over Europe and the Mesolithic mind takes shape, those places will still be there, waiting for new stories and new people to fill them. The forests do not arrive all at once. At first they are fingers of scrub and scattered trees in sheltered hollows, birch and willow edging streams, patches of pine on higher ground. Then, over a few thousand years, those fingers thicken, spread and link. What had been a patchwork becomes a cloak. Steppe grass retreats. Reindeer lines fray. The clear, long views across open country shrink into corridors of trunks and undergrowth. The sky becomes something you glimpse between branches. For the people who live through this, Europe is not just warming. It is changing shape. New animals move into this world and old ones retreat. Red deer, roe deer, wild boar, aurochs in the glades, beaver in the rivers, birds in dazzling seasonal waves. Salmon and trout fill the streams. Lakes and slow meandering rivers brim with pike, carp, eels. For hunters raised in the shadow of the ice, this is a different menu. The classic image of Ice Age Europe, a human silhouette against reindeer herds and mammoth bone shelters, begins to fade. In its place emerges something quieter, more hidden, people moving along riverbanks, building traps inside channels, setting lines for fish, collecting shellfish on new rising coasts. People stalking single animals through dense growth rather than driving whole herds across open snow. Archaeologists call this broad spectrum foraging, not leaning on one or two big animals, but drawing calories from many sources at once. Nuts, berries, tubers, small game, birds' eggs, fish, shellfish, sometimes even insects. Hazelnuts roasted in hearths, charred crabapple seeds, fish bones in heaps. You can think of it as a change in risk strategy. Steppe hunters gamble on big payouts with long dry spells in between. A single mammoth or reindeer drive can feed many mouths, but the hunt might fail. Broad spectrum foragers spread the risk. Many small efforts, each with modest returns, add up to a steady flow of food through the year. In a dense forest, that makes sense. The way people move changes too. On open tundra or steppe, Bands often follow long seasonal circuits, tracking herds over hundreds of kilometers. Winter camps and summer camps are far apart. Information and genes can travel huge distances as people meet at predictable choke points. River crossings, passes, rich hunting grounds. In a closed forest, long-distance line-of-sight navigation is harder. Paths twist along ridges, skirt bogs, hug river valleys. Big herds that once drew groups together are rarer. The landscape encourages shorter range circuits, more intensively used home territories, with detailed mental maps of streams, nut groves, salt licks, and animal trails. Mobility doesn't vanish, it changes scale. Bands still move, but often within a more tightly defined region, returning to key places as the seasons turn. A salmon run in spring, a hazel grove in autumn sheltered high ground for winter. This can make gene flow more local. Neighbours exchange marriage partners, trade raw materials, share stories, but the average lifetime travel radius may shrink compared to the great cold steppe journeys. Over centuries, those patterns leave signatures in DNA. When geneticists look at Mesolithic skeletons, people living in Europe after the ice has retreated, but before farming arrives, they do not see one uniform forest population. They see clusters. In Western and Northern Europe, many Mesolithic genomes fall into what researchers often call Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. These individuals share a suite of genetic traits distinct from both earlier Magdalenian-linked people and the later farmers who will come from the Near East. They form a loose family, stretching from Iberia through France and the Low Countries up toward the British Isles and parts of Scandinavia. Further east and south, especially in the Balkans and around the eastern Baltic, we meet somewhat different profiles, Eastern hunter-gatherers, or mixed ancestries that draw on both Western and Eastern sources. Some of these groups carry stronger ties to populations that had long been present around the Black Sea and farther into the steppe zones of Eastern Europe and Western Asia. The boundaries are not sharp, but they are real enough that when you map the genetic relationships, Europe in the Mesolithic looks more like a mosaic than a single colour wash. Local histories matter. A small group in a forested valley in what is now France may be closely related to other Western hunter-gatherers hundreds of kilometres away, yet their immediate marriage partners come from just over the next ridge. A lakeside community in what is now Poland may show eastern links because, for generations, their river has been a corridor to the steppe, a quiet highway of canoes and logboats. Social organisation bends around these realities. Territories, in a Mesolithic sense, are not fenced, but they are known. Families and bands appear to have customary rights to certain stretches of river, particular lakes, hunting grounds, or nut groves. These rights are probably defended, but also negotiated, reinforced through visits, shared rituals, and the careful giving and receiving of marriage partners. At certain times of year, those territorial lines soften. Evidence from sites rich in fish bones, worked antler, or elaborate ornaments suggests seasonal aggregation points, places where scattered bands gather for a few weeks or months. Salmon runs, mass fish spawning, seal haul-outs, or seasonal plant gluts could draw people in from wide areas. In those gatherings, stories are told, alliances renewed, disputes settled. Young people meet potential spouses from other groups. Children see faces they only remember from last year's visit. The genetic effect of these seasonal nodes is subtle but powerful. They stitch together a patchwork of small territories into a broader social fabric. Marriage networks probably followed their own careful logic. Some models of Mesolithic genomes suggest that spouses often came from neighbouring groups rather than from within the same small band, which would help avoid inbreeding. Over generations, this kind of structured exchange produces a pattern where relatedness is high within a region, but distinct between regions. You can imagine it as ripples overlapping, but never quite blending into a single pool. In this forested Europe, the phrase first people becomes even more misleading. There is no single lineage carrying some pure, ancient essence of the continent. Instead, there are many overlapping strands: Western hunter-gatherers, Eastern hunter-gatherers, remnants of earlier Magdalenian descended groups, perhaps even echoes of still older refugial populations that our sparse data barely glimpse. Each valley, each coast, each river basin has its own sequence: who arrived first after the ice, who followed, who stayed, who left, who married whom, who died in a winter of hunger, who prospered after a lucky run of fish. From a great distance in a simplified textbook, they might blur into Mesolithic Europeans. Up close, in the bones and the tiny differences in their DNA, they resolve into many local stories, each with its own beginning and its own quiet end. And far to the north, where the forests thin and the ice still lingers on distant horizons, new paths are opening again. The last great blank on the map of post-glacial Europe is about to be filled. At the height of the last glacial maximum, there is no Scandinavia in the sense we know it. There is ice. A dome kilometres thick smothers what will one day be Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Baltic. Glaciers spill into what is now the North Sea. Britain is not an island, but the high ground of a wider plain. The northern half of Europe is an absence, a white weight pressing the crust of the earth down. For thousands of years people live at the margins of that weight, but they cannot live on top of it. Only when the great ice sheet begins to retreat do the far north and the Scandinavian peninsulas appear as a place where human feet can stand. This does not happen overnight. The ice pulls back in fits and starts. Massive meltwater lakes form along its front, dammed by ice walls that sometimes fail in catastrophic floods. New land emerges cold and raw, scraped down to bedrock, dotted with erratic boulders, the soil still thin and forming. First, low shrubs and pioneer plants creep across the bare ground. Then grasses and herbs, then in time, birch and pine, and later still, darker spruce. From the perspective of people living along the ice edge, this is a slow-motion invitation. Each decade, each generation, the line of habitable land moves a little further north. The question is, who accepts that invitation? And from where do they come? Here the DNA, the stone tools and the coastlines all whisper different parts of the story. One obvious corridor into the north lies along the Atlantic and North Sea coasts. As the ice melts and sea levels are still low, a broad plain stretches from what is now northern France and the Low Countries across the area that will later drown as the North Sea. Archaeologists call this drowned world Doggerland. Before it disappears beneath rising waters, it is almost certainly rich. River valleys, wetlands, shallow lakes, herds of animals, flocks of birds. It would have been an attractive route and a homeland in its own right, linking Britain with the continent. From this western and northwestern zone, groups with strong western hunter-gatherer ancestry could have moved gradually toward the retreating ice, tracking reindeer and other cold-adapted game, then later shifting to the mixed forests and coasts of the emerging North Sea basin and southern Scandinavia. Farther east, another corridor opens along the Baltic and the great rivers that flow toward it, the Vistula, the Oder, the Dnieper, the Neva. As the ice front retreats north and northeast, river systems reorganize, carving new channels, spawning lakes and wetlands that would have been magnets for fish, waterfowl, and game. Into these spaces move people with more eastern-leaning ancestries, groups related to the eastern hunter-gatherers, and perhaps to populations deeper in the Eurasian interior. When geneticists examine Mesolithic skeletons from around the Baltic and early Scandinavia, they do not find a single neat lineage. Instead, they see mixtures. Some individuals look mostly Western in their ancestry. Others carry a strong Eastern signal. Some look intermediate, as if descendants of parents or grandparents from different traditions, Western-leaning people moving in from one side, Eastern-leaning people from the other, meeting in a landscape that is still settling into its post-ice shape. But there is a third element to the northern story, one that the mountains and coasts suggest even before the genomes do: the sea itself. As the ice melts and global sea levels rise, shorelines jump, drown, rearrange. Yet for long stretches, coasts remain among the richest environments in the north. New archipelagos emerge from the ice, scattered islands where land meets cold, productive water. Seals haul out on rocks and skerries, seabirds nest in vast numbers. Fish courses funnel through narrows and sounds as they move inshore to spawn. For hunter-gatherers with the right skills, these places are wind-swept storehouses. Archaeological sites along the Atlantic, in the western Baltic, and in early Scandinavian contexts begin to show patterns that point to a new adaptation: intensive use of marine resources. Shell middens grow, fish bones accumulate in hearths. Seal remains appear with cut marks that speak of butchery, of fat harvested for lamps and calories, skins taken for clothing and shelter. At the same time, other finds hint at technologies that do not easily survive: fish weirs and traps, nets weighted with stones, perhaps dugout canoes or skin boats gliding between headlands and across sounds. These maritime skills leave only faint archaeological traces, but they leave genetic ones. When researchers look at the DNA of some northern Mesolithic individuals, particularly in coastal Scandinavia, they see combinations that suggest more than just a simple inland expansion. Some profiles look as though western-leaning populations with long Atlantic coast traditions, perhaps already familiar with shellfish and shoreline foraging, have mixed with eastern-leaning groups whose ancestors travelled along rivers and through the interior. The result is not a northern race, but a patchwork of communities, each with its own recipe of ancestry and its own version of sea-focused survival. In this world of islands, fjords, and skerries, mastery of the water can mean the difference between precarious living and relative abundance. A band that knows how to follow the seals, that can cross a sound to reach a rich rookery, that has the skill and social organisation to build and maintain boats and nets, can draw on resources that more inland-focused neighbours might struggle to exploit. Some genetic variants in later northern populations seem to reflect this long history of maritime dependence. Adaptations in fat metabolism, vitamin D processing, and other pathways that would be useful for people eating a diet heavily weighted toward fish and marine mammals under low-angle northern sun. But the picture is never clean. One challenge in telling the northern story is timing. Scandinavia and the high Baltic regions are relatively late to open up after the ice. By the time people can live there year-round, hunter-gatherer groups in more southerly forests and coasts have already been evolving, mixing and differentiating for thousands of years. Another challenge is simple scarcity. Bones do not preserve well in every soil. Many early coastal sites have long since vanished under the sea as shorelines rose. Some of the most important routes north and west, across Doggerland, along drowned fjords and estuaries are now on the seabed, investigated only in fragments. So what we see in the genetic record are snapshots, not a film. A burial here with predominantly Western ancestry. A skeleton there with a strong Eastern component. Another with a blend that suggests a grandparent from one side, a grandparent from the other. A few hints of continuity, a few clear signs of replacement or strong incoming gene flow. Do these represent waves of migration sweeping through and over each other? Slow trickles over millennia? Seasonal movements that gradually harden into permanent settlement? Probably all of these at different times and places. Rather than one route into Scandinavia, it may be more helpful to imagine several braided paths. One strand curls up from the southwest, across the low plains and coasts exposed by falling ice and still low seas. Another follows rivers and lakes from the southeast and east, tracing the meltwater landscapes of the retreating ice front. A third runs along the ever-changing rim of islands and sounds, a maritime corridor where knowledge of currents and weather is as important as any trail on land. Over generations, people move along these strands, sometimes in small family groups, sometimes in larger bands, pushed by climate shifts, local resource failures, or opportunities heard about through distant kin. They meet at river mouths, on seasonal fishing grounds, at seal haul-outs, at sheltered bays where driftwood piles up and flint can be traded. They exchange goods, stories, spouses. Children grow up hearing more than one accent, more than one set of legends about where their people came from. In their bones, in their DNA, those crossings are recorded as mixed ancestries and subtle gradients from west to east, from inland to coast, from river to sea. From a broad perspective, the far north looks like the last blank on the post-glacial map being coloured in. Up close, it is a place where different human histories converge, western, eastern, coastal, inland, each bringing its own toolkit, its own memories of the ice, its own ways of reading the sky and water. And once those roots are in place, rivers, coasts, and island chains worn into familiarity by generations of paddles and footsteps, they do not disappear. They become highways of a different kind, channels along which new ideas and new people will later move. Because even as hunter-gatherers establish their intricate world among fjords and forests, changes are brewing far to the south. People who do not merely harvest what grows and moves wild, but shape it. If you zoom out from the fjords and skerries of the north, the pattern you've just heard about doesn't stop there. It stretches across the whole of Ice Age and post-Ice Age Europe. Under the forests and fields of the continent we know today, there is another Europe, a Europe of rivers. The Danube, the Rhine, the Rhone, the Elbe, the Vistula, the Dnieper, the Volga. Their names come much later, but the water itself is already there, cutting paths through rock, joining mountains to lowlands, interiors to seas. For hunter-gatherers on foot, these rivers are not obstacles. They are highways. Follow a river upstream and it leads you toward highland hunting grounds, summer pastures, raw material sources. Follow it downstream, and it takes you through a chain of floodplains and wetlands, past fish runs and bird nesting sites, all the way to broad estuaries where fresh water mixes with salt. Where tributaries meet, paths cross. One valley opens into another. People travelling along different branches of the same system find themselves converging on the same seasonal camps, the same salmon runs, the same crossings to reach winter shelter on south-facing slopes. Over generations, these nodes of convergence become something more than just good places to fish or hunt. They become meeting places. Some of them are obvious even now. The upper Danube corridor linking Central Europe to the Balkans and the Black Sea, the great bend of the Dnieper curving through the eastern plains, the confluence zones where the Rhone meets its tributaries before spilling into the Mediterranean, where the Rhine and the Main point toward easy portages between different catchments. At these junctions, we begin to find traces of something that fits what the DNA is telling us. People are not staying strictly put. They are moving and they are mixing. When geneticists talk about admixture, it can sound like a one-time event, a dramatic moment when population A meets population B and produces a new, blended group. But the reality, especially in Ice Age and early post-Ice Age Europe, is almost never that clean. Admixture is not a single night. It is a long, slow dawn. A small group moves up a river valley from the west, looking for better hunting or following a story someone's uncle told about rich land upstream. They spend a winter near another band whose ancestors came from the east. Maybe they share a hunt, then a feast. Maybe a woman from one group chooses a partner from the other. Children are born who carry parts of both ancestries. The next generation, one of those children drifts back downstream with cousins, marries into yet another group, leaves a few descendants, then moves on again. Another sibling stays, but their own children later join a band that is passing through, heading toward a different tributary. Over time, this creates layers. Not two colours mixed once and forever, but a constant swirled pattern. Strands of ancestry stretching along rivers, thinning out in some places, thickening in others, doubling back when conditions change. When we look at ancient DNA from places like the Middle Danube, the Rhone Valley, the Baltic rivers, we often see exactly this kind of pattern. Individuals from the same broad area, within a few centuries of each other, can show surprisingly different blends of ancestry. Some look more like people from far to the west, others like people from the east or south. Others are in between. This does not necessarily mean new waves sweeping in and wiping out whoever was there before. Sometimes that happens, especially when climates shift rapidly or new technologies appear. But very often the genetic evidence looks like something quieter, a trickle of small groups along familiar routes, meeting, merging, and sometimes splitting apart again. Burial sites give us another angle on this. In some cemeteries, most of the individuals look like they belong to a fairly tight-knit local population. Similar diets, similar grave goods, similar genetic profiles. And then, every so often, there is someone who stands out. A woman buried with ornaments made of shells that only occur hundreds of kilometers away. A man whose grave includes a stone tool type typical of another region. A child with teeth that show they grew up on a different kind of water and food than the people buried around them. Sometimes the DNA confirms this. Their genetic signature links them more closely to distant groups than to their immediate neighbours. Sometimes the DNA says the opposite. Genetically they fit right in, but their grave goods suggest connections far beyond the valley where they were laid to rest. In both cases the pattern is similar. These are not isolated points on a quiet map. They are nodes in a network. Isotope analysis sharpens this picture. The enamel of your teeth forms in childhood and locks in a chemical record of the water you drank and the food you ate while you were growing. Different regions have subtly different ratios of certain isotopes, variants of elements like strontium, oxygen and carbon. By comparing these isotope ratios in ancient teeth and bones to local baselines, scientists can ask, did this person grow up here or somewhere else? In some Ice Age and Mesolithic cemeteries, we see a mix. Individuals whose isotope signatures match the local geology and climate, and others whose signatures point to entirely different regions, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. The DNA might show they are related to the locals, a cousin, a spouse from another valley, a grandchild who moved with grandparents. Or it might show a distinct ancestry, suggesting that a truly new strand has been woven into the local web. Isotopes can also hint at diet. More freshwater fish, more marine resources, more plant-based calories. These patterns can differ between individuals buried side by side. A person whose DNA looks very local might have eaten like someone from the coast or from another ecological zone, perhaps because they travelled seasonally or married into a group with different subsistence habits. Put together, the genetics, the burial practices, the grave goods, and the isotopes all point toward the same general truth. Mysterious DNA in Europe is often not the fingerprint of a single dramatic invasion or a lost ghost people appearing, then vanishing overnight. More often it is the residue of exactly what you would expect in a world shaped by rivers and seasonal movement. People travel to a meeting place on the Danube bend for a shared hunt, a trade fair or a ritual gathering. A few families stay. A few families leave with spouses and in-laws from far away. Generations later, their descendants are still living in the valley, but their DNA carries traces of multiple roots. Western lines brought along the Rhine, eastern ones along the deeper, southern ones from the Adriatic or the Black Sea rim. Seen this way, Europe, after the ice, is not a puzzle of isolated tribes. It is a continent of corridors, where rivers and coasts, passes and plains channel movement in predictable yet flexible ways. A continent where almost every valley is, at one time or another, a crossroads. And the people whose bones we find along those waterways, the ones whose DNA seems strange or unexpected, may not be the last survivors of some vanished race. They may simply be what humans have always been, travellers standing at the junctions, carrying stories, genes and memories from one meeting place to the next. Soon into this braided world of rivers and gatherings, another kind of traveller will arrive. People who do not just follow the seasons, but reshape them. People whose ancestry tells a different story, growing from fields rather than from forests and floodplains. When we talk about farmers arriving, it can sound like a clear, sharp break. One day, the old hunter-gatherer world. The next day, fields, villages, and domestic animals. The reality, as far as we can tell from the bones and the DNA, is slower, messier, and much more interesting. Somewhere to the southeast, in regions that are now part of the Near East and Anatolia, people had already been experimenting with a different way of living. Instead of moving through landscapes and taking what each season offered, they began to stay put for longer and shape those seasons to their needs. They planted seeds in cleared patches of ground. They tended stands of wild cereals until wild began to blur. They kept small herds of animals close, feeding them, controlling their breeding, slowly nudging them away from their wild ancestors. This was not an overnight invention. It was a long series of small choices, but over generations it produced something genuinely new. Communities that could generate their own food rather than rely entirely on what the land volunteered. When people with this way of life began to edge into southeastern Europe, following familiar river corridors and lowland routes, they brought more than crops and animals. They brought a different tempo. Hunter-gatherers, even settled ones, live by cycles of movement, up to the high pastures in summer, down to sheltered valleys in winter, back and forth along coasts and rivers, as runs of fish and migratory herds appear and disappear. Early farmers lived by cycles of waiting and tending. Prepare a field in spring, guard it through summer, harvest in autumn, feed your animals through winter on what you stored. From a genetic point of view, this new way of life shows up as a new ancestry profile. The people who developed early agriculture in the Near East had been evolving in relative isolation for thousands of years, just as the foragers of post-Ice Age Europe had. Their DNA carries different patterns, different combinations of the same ancient bottlenecked genes. When they begin to appear in European burials, we can usually tell. In many early farming sites in the Balkans and Central Europe, the first generations of skeletons look, genetically, very much like Near Eastern farmers. Their bones often show the stresses of a sedentary, grain-heavy lifestyle, different kinds of wear and tear from grinding, digging, carrying loads, and living in close quarters with animals. For a while, in some regions, it can seem as if two separate worlds exist side by side. In the fertile river valleys and lowest plains, small farming villages appear, clusters of houses, storage pits, domestic animal bones, pottery. The people buried there have that new farming ancestry, with only a faint trace of local hunter-gatherer lines. Up in the hills, along the rougher coasts, deep inside the forests, hunter-gatherer groups continue their old ways, still following game and fish, still using stone and bone tools in familiar styles. In the DNA, they still look like the descendants of the Magdalenian and Mesolithic populations you've already met. Over time, though, these lines do not stay separate. The broad pattern across much of Europe is not replacement, but mixture. Sometimes the mixture is lopsided. In parts of Central Europe, the earliest farmers seem to absorb local hunter-gatherer ancestry quite slowly at first. For several centuries, most of the ancestry in farming villages still traces back to the Near East, with only small pulses of local genetic input. Then, generation by generation, the balance begins to shift. By the time we reach the Middle Neolithic in some regions, many farming communities carry a substantial fraction of hunter-gatherer ancestry, not because big bands of foragers stormed the villages, but because of quieter processes: marriages, adoptions, visiting and staying, perhaps occasional resettlement when crops failed and knowledge of wild resources suddenly became vital again. In other regions, especially along the Atlantic facade and in parts of northern Europe, the story looks different. Here, the old coastlines and wetlands, the deep forests and rocky shores seem to give hunter-gatherer groups more room to maneuver. For a long time after farmers have established themselves inland, we still find individuals on the coasts whose DNA is overwhelmingly hunter-gatherer in profile. Isotopes tell us they are eating a lot of fish and marine resources, not cereal grains. Their toolkits remain focused on hunting, fishing, and gathering. They do not vanish as soon as the first field is ploughed. In places like the Baltic and parts of Scandinavia, hunter-gatherer ancestry persists at high levels well into the farming period. Even when pottery and domestic animals appear, the genetic signatures tell us that many of the people using them are still, in essence, fisher-foragers who have added a few farming elements to their repertoire. In the west, along the Atlantic coasts of Iberia and France, we see similar patterns of delay and blending. Farming ancestry spreads in pulses and pauses, sometimes stalling at ecological frontiers where dense forests, poor soils, or rugged terrain make the classic Neolithic package less attractive. Where the land favours fields, broad river valleys, lowest plains, gentle basins, farmer ancestry tends to dominate sooner. Where the land favours fish, shellfish, game, and flexible movement, coasts, wetlands, uplands, local lineages hold out longer, and when mixing does happen, it often leaves a stronger imprint from the hunter-gatherer side. This is where the idea of lost children needs to be handled carefully. On a simple chart, it can look as if certain genetic lineages shrink over time, their percentages dropping as farming ancestry rises. It can be tempting to say these people disappeared, but at the level of individual lives, that is not usually what is happening. A hunter-gatherer woman marries into a farming village. Her children grow up between fields and forest edges, knowing both how to sow grain and how to read the tracks of wild animals. In their DNA, her ancestry is diluted to 50%, in their children to 25%. Go forward enough generations, and that specific hunter-gatherer lineage becomes a small fraction of the total genetic makeup of the community. Yet it is still there, absorbed, not erased. In other cases, the balance can tilt the other way. A small group of farmers finds itself in a region where their crops struggle, but the local foragers' skills are highly effective. Over time, the genetic and cultural centre of gravity can shift toward the older ways, even as certain farming practices, like keeping a few animals or planting small gardens, remain. From far away in time, these processes show up as changing percentages and shifting ancestry components. The forager lines seem to thin out, especially in the dense farming heartlands. But along certain coasts, in certain forests, in pockets of rough land, they thicken again, or persist in relatively pure form centuries after the first fields were sown just a few valleys away. So when we say that many of Europe's early hunter-gatherer populations are lost, it is not quite the same as saying that they were annihilated. Some lineages did end abruptly, through disease, conflict, or simple bad luck. Others were buffered into gradual absorption, their genes surviving in smaller and smaller fractions within growing farming populations. A few strands, in particular environments, seem to have held on stubbornly, feeding into the genetic tapestry of Europe long after the last purely foraging bands had shifted their ways of life or faded from the record. The children of the ice and forest did not simply step aside for the children of the fields. They met them, lived with them, sometimes fought them, often joined them. Their stories, written in DNA, become harder to read as they are woven into larger patterns, but they do not quite go away. And yet there are gaps, places and times where we can see only the ending of a line, not the path it took. Names and languages and songs that leave no direct trace in our genomes at all. Those are the truly lost children, the ones we know only as faint statistical shadows, as outliers in ancient cemeteries, as brief, bright signals that flicker and then vanish. Their absence and the limits of what DNA can show us are where the story turns next. When we look closely at the DNA record of Ice Age and early Holocene Europe, the same pattern appears again and again. A cluster of people appears in the data. Their genomes share a distinctive signal, a particular blend of older ancestries shaped in a specific place and time. For a while they're easy to follow. You see them in a string of burials along a river, or across a range of hills, or scattered from one cave to another over a few hundred years. Then gradually they fade. Their particular combination of markers becomes rarer in later samples. Their branch on the genetic family tree seems to thin out, then vanish. This is where the idea of lost children stops being a metaphor and starts to feel very literal, because we can see them at the population level. A small Magdalenian-related group hanging on in the far west while new influences spread from the southeast. A cluster of hunter-gatherers in Central Europe, whose ancestry profile almost disappears once farmers arrive. A coastal foraging community whose distinct signature survives for a while in the north, then becomes hard to trace. They appear, bloom briefly, and then, from our perspective, are gone. There are several ways this can happen. One is the simplest and the harshest: bottlenecks. A group can shrink to a handful of families through disease, famine, climate swings, conflict, or sheer bad luck. Even if some descendants survive, the narrower gene pool means much of the older variation is lost. From a distance, it looks as if a once diverse lineage has been forced through a narrow neck and come out much reduced on the other side. Another possibility is replacement. Sometimes newcomers arrive in numbers, with technologies or social systems that give them an advantage in those particular conditions. Over generations, the older population may be pushed into marginal land, absorbed in unequal marriages, or simply outbred. A few of their genes might persist, but the broader pattern that defined them as a group disappears under the weight of the new. More often, though, what we're seeing is admixture. That word simply means mixing, but in practice it covers a huge range of stories. A small foraging band joins a larger farming community. Their descendants marry widely within that new world. Within a few generations, their once distinct genetic profile has been chopped into segments and scattered through many people. Instead of one clear lineage, we now have hundreds of tiny fragments. Each person might carry only a sliver of the original pattern. When we run our statistical models, that earlier group no longer stands out as something separate. It dissolves into the background. In this way, whole peoples can vanish from our charts without ever leaving the landscape. There is also a quieter reason certain lineages seem to disappear: the limits of our sampling. Ancient DNA comes from the bones and teeth we've happened to find, in the soils that preserve them, from the sites that have been excavated, in the countries that currently fund and allow this kind of work. Huge parts of Europe, especially former coastal plains now under the sea, river valleys scoured by floods, uplands where acidic soils eat bone, have given us almost nothing. It's entirely possible that some of the lost ancestries simply lie in places we haven't looked yet, or in individuals whose remains have not survived. When we say a lineage stops appearing after a certain date, what we often mean is more modest. We haven't seen it yet in the samples from later times. Absence in this field is rarely absolute. It is usually a mirror of where we've dug, where DNA survives, and what kind of patterns our methods are tuned to detect. This is why it's important to be cautious with language. It is tempting to talk about Western hunter-gatherers or early farmers or steppe herders as if they were fixed, simple blocks of identity. It is tempting to say that one replaced another, or that someone was 50% this, 50% that, as if a human life could be reduced to neat fractions. But the people living through these changes didn't wake up in the morning as percentages. They were not labels on a graph. They were individuals with names we don't know, speaking languages we can't recover, carrying stories, loyalties, fears, and hopes that do not map cleanly onto our categories. A woman whose genome we classify as mostly early farmer with some local hunter-gatherer ancestry might have thought of herself first as a member of a particular valley, a particular kin group, a particular house. The minor ancestry component our software almost misses could represent a beloved grandparent whose songs and skills shaped her childhood far more than the majority of her genetic signal. Genetic tools are powerful, but they are also blunt. They average, they smooth, they turn 1,000 intertwined relationships into a handful of components with tidy names. It's important to remember that what we call lost children are not just percentages that dropped below a threshold. They were people whose threads were woven into new fabrics until the original pattern became hard for us to see. The story is not finished either. Every few years, a new site changes the picture. A burial ground on a windswept headland reveals a community of foragers living much later than we thought possible in that region. A lakeside village shows more hunter-gatherer ancestry than expected deep into the farming era. A single tooth from a cave or a fragment of bone dredged from a riverbed adds a new branch to the family tree. Technologies are improving as well. Sequencing methods grow more sensitive, able to read DNA from increasingly damaged remains. Analytical tools become better at teasing apart faint signals, at recognizing that what once looked like a single component may actually be several distinct ancestries blurred together. And then there are the places we can't easily reach yet. Submerged landscapes along the North Sea, the Black Sea, and the Atlantic coasts once held shores, river mouths, and estuaries where people would have lived for thousands of years. As sea levels rose after the Ice Age, many of those worlds drowned. Their stories for now are hidden under silt and salt water. But as underwater archaeology advances, as sonar mapping and offshore drilling occasionally bring up traces of human presence, it's possible that some of the missing chapters in Europe's genetic history may surface there. If that happens, some of the lost children we glimpse as brief genetic shadows might step into clearer focus. New names will be proposed for new clusters. Old models will be revised. Lineages that seem to end abruptly may turn out to have taken unexpected paths across the continent before merging into later populations. Through all of this, one thing remains steady. Change is constant, but it is rarely total. Every person in ancient Europe was a bridge between past and future, carrying forward an inheritance shaped by bottlenecks, migrations, and quiet local continuity, and passing it on in altered form. Lineages rise and fall in our charts. Certain signals brighten, then dim. Others, long overlooked, begin to glow under a different kind of analysis. Yet beneath the statistics and the shifting labels there is an unbroken thread. Bodies born, lives lived, children raised, knowledge passed on. Even the stories we can't finish still feed into the ones that follow. By the time we reach our own place in this long sequence, almost all of those early patterns have been broken down and recombined countless times. But they are not gone. They are still here, moving quietly through us. Reminders that continuity does not mean staying the same. It means changing, again and again, without ever quite losing the memory of what came before. As we drift toward the end of this story, you can let your mind step back from the details for a moment and just feel the outline. From the cramped shelters of the last glacial maximum to the narrow ice-free valleys where Magdalenian hunters followed reindeer and horses to the post-glacial forests where Mesolithic foragers moved along rivers and coasts, to the first fields cut into those woods by early farmers, and the later waves of movement that layered new ancestries onto old, across all of that, one pattern keeps repeating. People finding places to endure, people taking hold, adapting, changing, and then sooner or later being folded into something new. When we tell it as a single story, it can sound smooth, almost inevitable, as if there was always a clear path leading from those Ice Age camps to the modern map of Europe. But the truth, as far as we can tell, is far more ragged and unfinished. The genetic map of Europe's first people is not a neat picture. It is a draft covered in pencil marks and question signs, a sketch that keeps being redrawn every time a new bone gives up its DNA, every time a different model is tried. Some lines we think we see with confidence may soften or bend with new data. Some gaps may turn out to be full of lives we simply haven't sampled yet. Some apparent turning points might be illusions caused by the few sites that happen to have survived. Under the ice sheets, along the drowned continental shelves, in caves whose sediments have never been sifted, there are still vast territories of unrecorded ancestry. When we say a certain signal disappears, or a group is replaced, it's really shorthand for something more tentative, that for now their particular pattern has slipped below the level we can trace. What remains clear, even through the uncertainty, is how much of this history was carried by people who would never have thought of themselves as part of a grand story. Most of the shaping power lay with ordinary days. A child taught to knap flint on a riverbank. A woman deciding which plants to gather at the forest's edge. A hunter choosing to stay and marry into another band rather than follow his relatives further north. A family joining a new village, bringing with them a way of fishing, or a song, or a memory of a place now under the sea. Each of these small decisions nudged the flow of genes and ideas. Each quiet life added its thread to the fabric we now try to read in sequences and percentages. When you listen to the language you grew up with, when you look at your hands, when you breathe in the night air where you are participating in that same slow accumulation. You are one more point in a chain that runs back through medieval farmers and Bronze Age herders, through Mesolithic foragers and Ice Age migrants, through refuges at the edge of the ice, and further back still to the survivors of much older crises. The lost children of the Ice Age are not entirely gone. Pieces of their story are sitting quietly in the cells of everyone alive today. We don't know all the paths they took. We don't know all the faces that once looked out over frozen rivers, or springtime floodplains, or the first green clearings in the woods. But we know they were there. We know they endured long enough to leave traces that can still be read, faint but real, in our genomes and in the landscapes they altered. As you ease into sleep, you can imagine their world slowly darkening, not with disaster but with distance, their languages falling silent, their names unspoken, while their descendants move on into new arrangements, new identities, new stories. The long night of time closes over them, but the echoes remain. If this journey through that deep past has helped you relax, or given you something gentle to think about as you fall asleep, you might like to hear more stories like it. If you feel comfortable, you can softly tap like or subscribe so you'll find your way back here when you want another quiet history to drift off to. And if you're awake enough, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? You can leave a comment with the place you're resting in, a city, a region, a coastline, a valley. Another tiny mark on the living map that grew from those ancient wandering lives.